So welcome to the Compassionate Capitalist podcast and video for those that are tuning in and watching today. As you know, for those that listen often, we work on having experts in areas and unique perspectives for the common goal of what I'm trying to do with the compassionate capitalist movement, and that is to expand people's perspectives about investing in entrepreneurs, best practices for investing in entrepreneurs, as well as for entrepreneurs, are the best practices for attracting capital and then growing your business to a successful exit. And of course, one of the best ways to get that information is when you get a unique situation where you have a successful entrepreneur and a successful investor all in one. And that's my guest today, Joe Beverly. So say hello, Joe, and then I'll introduce you officially.
Thanks,
So
Karen.
I've known Joe for a few years now. And when we ran into each other on one of these, um, in COVID, we don't see each other a lot face to face these days anymore. And so ran into each other on a pitch event recently. And I saw that he had started an incubator, the Cranium Incubator. And I was like, wow, that's exciting. I need to learn about that. So we got together, we talked, and I invited him to be on this show because he had some very unique perspectives. And we're going to share those with you today. So let me tell you about Joe. So he's the founder, as I said, the Cranium Incubator. It is an inclusive neural network that started in 2020, and we'll dig into that. Before Joe felt called to launch the Cranium Incubator, he served as president of the Atlanta Technology Angels. And not all angel investors got their wealth from a big exit to go from entrepreneur to an investor seat. And many angel investors, as was the case with my own angel investor group that I managed for a decade, the network of business angels and investors, create their wealth from their own business and establish an investment strategy to take personal wealth from their own success and seek to invest it in entrepreneurs they believe will succeed. Remember, the definition of a compassionate capitalist is someone who invests time, knowledge, resources, and capital into entrepreneur endeavors that bring innovation to the market, create jobs, and generate wealth for all those involved. And Joe Beverly is absolutely a compassionate capitalist. After graduation from the University of Georgia with a bachelor's in international business, he worked at a corporate gig in Data Point Corp before starting his own business in 1984. His company, Adaptable Systems Corp, started by providing accounting systems to clients and shifted to payroll services in 1991 and continues to grow year over year doing business as corporate payroll services. So, welcome to the Compassionate Capitalist Show, Joe. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks a lot. I'm glad to be here.
So as we mentioned earlier, our topic is to, specifically the compassionate capitalist, the Cranium Incubator, an inclusive neural network. So I want to first ask about sort of fill in the gaps on your story. What made you decide to start your own business and how did you actually get it started? Was it through SBA, savings, bootstrap, a side gig before you left the corporate world, your own investors? Talk a little bit about what motivated you to start that.
Yeah, so I started, as you mentioned, in 1984. I was not funded by large investors or anything. It was just bootstrapped. And I, just used personal funds, and I had been in sales, and I knew that I would, or felt like I would be able to sell enough to keep my head above water. So that's what I did. And we actually, I started in one business, and about 6 years later, we pivoted into a very different business, got into the payroll service business in 1991, and have been doing that since.
Yeah, and had you always wanted to be an entrepreneur and it was I'm going to go to school, get experience in corporate world and then do this, or because it's that whole born or bred idea of an entrepreneur and what their motivation is.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I knew I always wanted to be. I had a very lower middle class background growing up, and certainly was not born with a silver spoon in my mouth. So, I knew that I didn't want to be poor, and and I felt like being an entrepreneur was one way to hopefully make that not happen. So, yeah, I was definitely, didn't raise a lot of investor money or anything like that. Did raise a little bit of friends and family once we started the payroll service business in 1991, and raised some money actually from a guy who had started working for me, and he believed in what we were doing, and he still works for me over 30 years later.
Oh,
So
nice.
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah. So, okay. So then not till like 1991, when did you even know of that as an angel investor at that time? Or it was just somebody you knew you needed some money and he was willing to kind of partner up, or had folks that were part of it? Did you call it that at that time when you talked to him?
I don't think I knew at that time that it was. I really didn't know what angel investing was at that time. I don't think I became familiar with the concept of angel investing until a little bit after that. Um, but didn't do anything about it until 2013 when I joined the Atlanta Technology Angels.
Well, that's interesting. So you were, I think, were you invited? Like they had reached out to you and said, "Hey, come check us out," or were you started looking around to see if there was anybody doing this angel investor thing?
Yeah, I started looking around and found, Atlanta Technology Angels, found their website. I, put in contact information on that. I actually didn't get a call back and, or, a contact back. And so I called someone else that I knew was in a private equity group and said, "Hey, do you know anybody who's, with the Atlanta Technology Angels?" And he gave me a couple names. And so he gave me two names. I called both of them, and figuring that, well, one of them probably won't call me back. They ended up both calling me back. So one was Michael Horton, and then Steve Waldron.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, anyway, so
Okay.
that's, I ended up talking to both of them, and, got invited to join and all that good stuff.
Good. So, when we were chatting the other day, I was pleasantly surprised at how many investments you've made since you started. Was it like 16? And
16. Yeah.
yeah, and out of how many of have you considered?
Oh my gosh. I guess I've seen probably, I'm guessing I've seen at least 300 presentations, probably more. I've gotten into some level of due diligence on probably, I would guess, at least 35 to 40, um, maybe even a little more than that. And, gotten into pretty deep due diligence on probably at least 30, and then decided for one reason or other, something didn't work out.
So, well, one of the things that because as you know, I have my book, Inside Secrets to Angel Investing. For those that are looking, there it is on my
Which
page.
I've read. It's a great book, so
Ah,
I recommend people read it.
thank you so very much.
You can pay me
So,
later.
yeah. So, but one of the things that I talk about in there is the value of, particularly when you're starting out, being part of a group. Now, it's intended for that person that's just trying to figure it out and figure out how and they play and how they participate, and if they may or may not geographically be in a place where or have the time, because there's depending on the structure of angel groups, there's a time commitment you have to make to participate in the committees, to screen them and do due diligence and all those kind of things. So, do you have any particular, inside secret, if you will, as to, because I guess you've made some investments outside of the group, the value, particularly for you when you were first getting started, of starting through a group like ATA?
Absolutely significant value from, doing that. I tell people that I generally am a do-it-yourselfer. So one of the things I'll tell people is that, if a toilet breaks in my house, I'll fix it. I could pay somebody to fix it, but, I know how. I can take it apart. I can, I'll fix it. Had to fix a couple of weekends ago. So I'm generally a do-it-yourselfer, but for angel investing, I strongly suggest not being a do-it-yourselfer because you just get this participation from other people. You get their great ideas. You get, where you're sitting around, well, used to be sitting around a physical table. Now it's maybe on a Zoom meeting, but you're sitting around a table with a bunch of other smart investors and they're asking questions which make me hit my head and say, oh, I should have thought to ask that question. I like to think that I ask some questions also that make them hit their heads and think, oh yeah, I should have asked that question. But you get much better due diligence, I think, when you do it in a group. So even though I'm very much a do-it-yourselfer, I very much for angel investing suggest people that they do it with other people and get multiple people's minds on doing the due diligence.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, did you set up an investment thesis when you first were getting going? Like you knew because you knew like financial systems and accounting, so you're going to do fintech, or were you just sort of a sponge and waiting to see what came from this group and this collaborative approach that they have?
Yeah, I would say more of a sponge. There are some good statistics which came out of a study that was done. I think it was initially done in 2006 or 7 and then updated in 2016, but they studied a lot of different angel investments, like over 5,000 investments with over 1,100 exits.
Wow.
And I became familiar with that study very early, like probably late 2013 or early 2014. And one of the things that came out of that was that if you have industry expertise, in that study, those who had industry expertise had about 2x their investment. So in other words, if they invested $1, they got $2 back if they had industry expertise in that investment. But there were other things that had much greater returns. So for example, for those investors who did less than 20 hours of due diligence, the average returns were something like 1.1 or 1.2 or 1.3. But for those who had average returns, who did due diligence of more than 20 hours, their average returns jumped to something like 5.7x.
Really?
And for those who did more than 40 hours of due diligence, their returns jumped to something like 7.1 or 3 or something like that, X. And so because I came to understand that more due diligence had a much greater impact than having industry expertise, I decided, okay, I'm going to try to do a lot of due diligence. If I had only invested in financial type companies, I might not have made any investments already.
Oh, sure.
So there might not have been any. And so I decided that, okay, I was going to make sure I did a lot of due diligence. And if I didn't know anything about the industry, that I would educate myself. And I have. I mean, I've educated myself on genetics and on physics and just some things that I really didn't have any formal training in in order to be more knowledgeable about, whatever particular business was that I was looking at.
Well, and I would think too, the collaborative nature of a group is that there likely is somebody in that group that has that expertise. So you get to, get conversational, on the topic with them where they can dig a little bit deeper. That was within NBA and I. We didn't have quite the structure that ATA has, but that was a big thing when we would have a deal champion because the deal champion would be somebody that knew that industry significantly better than the other people knew the industry.
Yeah.
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 And we're going to talk a little bit later about transparency in the due diligence process because I think that's important and that's something that I will wrap up with in some best practices. But I wanted to ask, so part of I always tell entrepreneurs when they're working towards investors, and there's the difference of subjective investors and objective investors, people in the business of investing, right? And everybody that's in the business of investing, they're committed, like you are, certain amount of hours in a week. Even though you run, you still operate a successful business. And even they commit the time, they commit the, to do the research, they commit to do the due diligence, and they always make it. They're very common will make a mistake. I actually, the podcast that I have going live next is me talking about some mistakes that I have made based off of this concept of customer discovery, which you and I have talked about as well, which is a big plus of an incubator, right? And I've made some of those same mistakes because you fall in love with the technology, or you fall in love with the passion of that entrepreneur, and you kind of like you hedge in an area, you don't do the proper due diligence, right? So is there any kind, and I say that there's always this hidden checklist of the things that I'll never do that again, right?
Mhm.
That you kind of, when you're watching a pitch or you're seeing something and your little red flag goes, oh, I remember that from direct experience. Do you have anything that's on your inside secret, your hidden checklist, like, oh, if I knew what I knew now, I wouldn't have done that. Or now that I know that, it would seem so logical to not have done that. I wish I had just sat in the moment and thought about it a little bit longer from your early days of investing. You can share.
Yeah, so one of my very first investments, and I've definitely learned things over time. So I didn't know as much then, certainly, as I know now. And the founders in that investment had, more like corporate salaries than startup salaries. And I know now that's that one went to a total zero, which a lot of them are going to do that. The stats that came out of that same study I mentioned more or less indicated that if you make 10 investments, 4 will probably go to zero, 5 will be break even as a group, and you're likely to have 1 out of that 10 that will provide significant enough returns to make up for all those losses. So that one was one that, one of the ones that went to zero. And I like to think I would not have made that investment today. So,
Yeah, I know. That's I think early on, Sig Mosley, who I know you know well, he's a legend in the Atlanta angel tech market, told me a long time ago that that was one of his criteria, right? Is, and one of the things he calls it a hunger factor, that when he looks at some of the CEOs, when he's made an investment, if they're coming out of a corporate fat cat gig and they just feel like they got to go start a business, they're not prepared for the hard work that it's going to take to burn the midnight oil, take a haircut when you need to because you got to make payroll, all those kind of things you do as a hungry startup founder, that sometimes people from wherever they come from don't necessarily have that same perspective. They're not used to being the one-armed paper hanger because they had like all these people that they could go get to do different things, right? And
sure.
that's one of those things that you learn from. So switching over to talk about this incubator that's so exciting, right? So your tagline, let me just say this too, for the Cranium Incubator, for those, the website, CRANIUM dash incubator, which is spelled INCUBATOR.com. An inclusive neural network. Explain that tagline and this need for inclusion.
So we spent, I and this lady who is helping me, with the incubator, we spent, I don't know how much time coming up with a name and coming up with a tagline. I mean, we talked about all kinds of things, but once we came up with Cranium Incubator, the Cranium Incubator, then, the cranium obviously is what encloses your brain, right? So, and we thought that an inclusive neural network, because that's related to that, would be a great tagline
It is.
because it is inclusive. We are looking for, female and or minority founders, and, hoping to help them. So, and then, one other thing, the attendees to the incubator, we call them brainiacs. That's the way
Okay.
we refer to them. So,
Good. Good. Well, now, and you started it right sort of in the midst of the pandemic, right? At the beginning of 2020. So what made you feel that the time was right to start? Had the pandemic and the economic malaise started when you launched Cranium and you just sort of were ahead of the wave on that? Or how to talk about the timing and your decisions on those?
yeah, so what happened was for my business, I had bought a piece of property that had, a couple of buildings on it. And one of the buildings we were going to occupy, the other building had a couple of tenants in it, but had some empty space. And this was in the fall of 2019. And I thought, I wouldn't mind starting an incubator slash, co-working space in some of that empty space. And so I had planned on that. The lady who was helping me, I had spoken with her and had in that late fall and had said, hey, this is one of the things I'm thinking about doing. Would you be interested in helping with that? And she's like, oh, very, very interested. And I said, and my intention is to make this for minorities and or female owners. And she said that would be great. I'd be very interested in that. And so anyway, started making some plans towards that, but she didn't actually start working until mid-February. And the night of March 2nd, I sent an email to all my employees saying, hey, we got to figure out how to work from home. People got to be distanced from each other if they're in the office. And from that point through about June or July, I was probably working 100-hour weeks just trying to keep my business going and do all the other things, kind of do some of the bare minimum stuff relative to angel investing. Wasn't really looking at new investments so much then, but finally, kind of once that stuff got settled out, then in like late July, early August, I said, okay, let's make this happen. And we're going to start our first cohort in September, come hell or high water, and that's what we're going to do. And so, so that's what we did. That was the timing of it.
Yeah, so great because so you really had identified that you wanted to do this an inclusion perspective long time, before there was this spotlight shown on the lack of diversity within. It's amazing to me that since spring, definitely through the summer, but really early on in spring, in part because of the Black Lives Matters marches, but also I think the pandemic showed so much of this difference between rural and urban, and who was getting access to capital, where were the new jobs coming, who was suffering the most a lot within small businesses that were struggling, and some of those not necessarily the tech kind of companies that angel investors traditionally invest in, but it seems like it's become very. I know I hate to use the word trendy because I would like to think that it's just an awareness that investor communities have become aware, and a lot of us, I know myself included, did this whole perspective on what do we have a bias, do we have a sexual bias, a racial bias, do we have that? I know early I always thought that money was green, and investors didn't have a bias until I'd actually talked to a few after some of my pitch events, and I'd say, and I think this company was great, it might have been a woman presenter, and it'd be like, why aren't you interested in that? And you know it's hard to say at the hindsight whether that was a bias at that time or not. And so had you seen this yourself within your, because we had a little bit of a conversation about conscious bias and unconscious bias. Share that with our listeners about what was when what was it a journey that you were on, or did you have an aha moment that said, this is something I have the ability, the experience, the resources to do this, and so this is something that me, Joe Beverly, is going to do to, because there's plenty of incubators, right?
Mhm.
Atlanta itself's got 35 plus or something like that, right? So,
Mhm.
to take on a different mission. Tell a little about that journey and that your perspective on that, please.
Yeah, I wouldn't say, I can't point to, it'd make a great headline, but I can't point to one moment where I said, aha, I can't really say that. But certainly I became aware of the significant funding gap between, minority and female firms, and, white males. And, you know, fortunately, I was not raised to think any differently of anybody because of their skin color, their gender, anything like that. So I don't, I wasn't trained to be that way, if you
Right.
will. And so, I really, over some period of time said, that's really bad. It shouldn't be that way. And there are statistics which indicate that female and minority-owned firms do very well in terms of providing investor returns. And so, combination of those two things, I'm like, well, if that second fact is true, then there should be no reason why they are not getting more funding. And as you mentioned, we had that discussion about conscious and unconscious biases. Potentially we all have unconscious biases. And some people have conscious biases, but I try not to associate with anybody that I know has any conscious biases, but that happens. But assuming that you're dealing with people who have unconscious biases, and because as I mentioned, I've seen well over 300, maybe 400 presentations, but I've made 16 investments. Well, you do the math. It's not like the only investments I saw were female and minority or white male or any of those. Right. I've seen presentations from all of those. And so, in that I've seen all those presentations, but only made 16 investments, it's a very selective process. The investors that I know, that I hang around with, I don't, like I say, I don't know of any conscious biases they have. And so what I decided was, and what I believe is true, is that it is more an issue of education, not necessarily formal education, but education of this is how you present to investors. Here are the things you need to understand. Here's the way your presentation needs to look. Here are the things you need to be able to know. Once the presentation is done, you need to be able to also back that up with understanding what your gross margins are and understanding what an income statement is and a balance sheet. And there's this whole long list of topics that we cover. Basically how to start, fund, run, and grow a business. And so that was the reason for starting this, is to hopefully give those people as much information as I can give them about, to educate them essentially.
Yeah.
The things they need to know to have a better chance. 100% of them aren't going to raise money. I mean, that's just the way it is. But I'm trying to at least give them a leg up, right, and give them better chances to be able to raise money.
Well, and also I think going through your cohort like that, even if they decide not to raise capital or they, modify their business, they're going to learn so much about the process of having a successful business anyway, right? So now, do you do your cohorts every quarter, or how often do you do them?
Yeah, so we did one in the fall. We're getting close to the end of one now, and we will start our next cohort in April. We don't know the exact date. It'll probably be, it'll be probably in that first week of April that we'll get started. We haven't done the final schedule yet.
Yeah.
And we'll be accepting applications for it up until probably about March 31st, or maybe even April 1st, 2nd, 3rd, somewhere in there.
And so are these Georgia companies? They come and be here. Are they all Atlanta companies?
They're a variety. So we have, so one of our attendees, our brainiacs, in the current cohort, he is in New Jersey. And actually you're familiar, I'm sure, with the Startup Runway, that's done. And he won that competition. So, which was great. And anyway, he's one of the ones in our current cohort. He's in New Jersey. I know last cohort we had somebody in Texas or Louisiana or somewhere. And so, I mean, we've had, we have people from different places. A lot of them are concentrated in Atlanta, I think, just because that's a lot of where my network is and the people that I know and stuff. But yeah, no, we're happy to have anybody. We did have somebody apply from India last time, and they ended up not being in that cohort. But I mean, it would have been really tough because our sessions start at 6 in the evening, and that would be like 3:30 in the morning or something in India. So 3:30, 4:30.
Yeah. So will you continue to do them virtual? So you're have a broader potential for getting qualified companies?
For now, we're going to do them virtually. We got to see what happens with people getting vaccinated and all that stuff. And
yeah,
the number of cases, get down to a very low level. Eventually, I would like to do them in person, but I think that even once we do start to do them in person, I think that we will also have a virtual, it'll be a combination of in person and virtual.
Yeah, you were sharing with me the this idea that you use to illustrate what an entrepreneur has to do in order to qualify for investor capital for serious, the people that are in the business of investing. And you talked about, the difference between and not getting an A as a 90 or 90 or 100. So share that parable or whatever it might be, because I love that. It was really,
Yeah.
really perfect.
Yeah. So, I gave you the numbers a few minutes ago about having seen 300, maybe 400 presentations. I've made 16 investments. You can do the math that this is not like a test that we took in high school or college or wherever, where, you make a 90 on the test, you make an A, and that's a good grade, right? For investors, a 90 is failing, a 95 is failing. So you've got to make like a 98, 99, or 100 maybe to, quote, make an A on that test, where you're going to even get to that next level probably. So, 95 might get you into one more session where they're going to ask more questions, but you have to ace it from there. So yeah, it's not like, and that was, it's funny, the guy that won the Startup Runway, Daryl Frater is his name, he told me, I guess it was weekend before last now, but I was talking to him and he said that really stuck with him. And don't get me wrong, he was, he had a good presentation before I went through his presentation with him. But I like to think I made a few improvements to it that helped him, but he had a good, solid presentation. He's a good, solid entrepreneur. But he said that really stuck with him and really made him think, okay, it's got to be perfect. It's not good enough, isn't going to be good enough. It's got to be perfect.
So when these women and minority founders go through your cohort, through your thing, one of the things that I always try to encourage women and minority businesses is to, don't, so many of them, I think the reason why they haven't had a seat at the table, besides, not the money for sources, not reaching out to try to attract them, but they also have this fear of asking for capital, right? There's a lot of times entrepreneurs will have that. They know they need it, but they don't ask for capital or approach asking for capital from a position of strength and confidence, right? So, it's like do the work, own your story, and find the ones that share the vision. One of the things that you shared with me, though, you also, because that's kind of like getting to that 98, right? You got to get there. You have to have that, right? But you also found that minority and women founders are less arrogant. so they tend to succeed. So talk about this concept of you've got to be confident, but the balance of confidence and humility to be successful when it comes to raising capital and being able to get the right guidance from
Yeah.
investors that are choosing to invest in you.
Yeah, it's a pretty short answer. You know, it's important to be confident, and confidence is good. But there are people who cross over into arrogance, and arrogance is really, really bad. And the reason arrogance in my mind is really, really bad is that when you get to that arrogance of, well, I just can't do anything wrong and I'm perfect and all that, then you're not looking for what might be coming behind you to bite you in the hindquarters. And I certainly have made plenty of mistakes in running my business, mistakes that cost the business lots of money. But I've also done some things successfully. But I've made enough mistakes to know that I'm not perfect, and there are plenty of things that can come bite me. And any entrepreneur who's just starting out, I mean, I'm still that way today. I know things could all go south. So, and any entrepreneur who's just starting a business, they have got to be looking out for all potential threats that they face, because there is just a boatload of those threats that can face them. So it's good to be confident. I suggest that people develop confidence by knowing their stuff. They have studied, they've worked, they stay up till 2, they whatever, to make sure they understand all the things they need to understand, certainly about their business, but then just about more mundane topics, whether it's accounting or whether it's marketing or selling or whatever it is, that they're doing everything and anything they can to learn all those things. When they get that education, they will be more confident, and it will be deserved, and it won't be arrogant, because they know their stuff. And
Yeah.
they should be, you mentioned the word humility, they can also be humble. But I think that good combination of confidence, but also with a dose of humility, I think that's a good combination.
Yeah, and so let's talk. We mentioned it at the top of the hour. The this idea of within due diligence is the transparency. So yes, you're doing your right math on your numbers, and you're understanding who your customer is, customer discovery, all that kind of stuff. But one of the things that I have found that is you can never recover from. You can always get more insight about your customer if you got a fundamental right business model and that kind of stuff. But lack of transparency, and it's not directly being dishonest, but when an entrepreneur knows that there is something that has happened in the past that is a material fact and they don't disclose it to the investors, when the investors find that out because they do due diligence, that it will kill the deal for them, and there is no recovering. You can recover, so I'll use one of my examples, and I'm sure you have an example. It was a company that we'd actually raised quite a bit of money for within the NBA and I. They're still out there. They're still a going concern. It's a non-allergenic latex called Vitex, and at the time, the founder of it, the inventor, had and we had this I had this our local group had done it, but I was also syndicating with this group of doctors up out of Tennessee or someplace, and they loved it because the idea of non-allergenic latex gloves, initially was sort of the catheters and things like that. So the medical space totally got it. Well, apparently he had been investigated by the FDA about one of his claims on something else unrelated to this, and he didn't disclose it because it had been resolved favorably towards him, but it wasn't in any of his disclosures. So when they, as doctors, went and Googled, all they found was the complaint. They didn't find initially all that other stuff. So he could go and show that, oh, it was all fine. It was everything they investigated. It was all fine. But he had already lost their trust And even though it was like not that big of a deal in that particular situation, he had not disclosed it. And so that was like $1 million that he was due to get from that investor group that was gone. There was no coming back from that. So it's so important. And I've had other examples, one of an investor that you and I both know, he did his due diligence, found this thing in somebody's history that had been an SEC issue, again, had been resolved, but because he didn't disclose it, killed that guy. He was queued up, ready to put a six-figure check into them,
Mhm.
done, gone, dead. So, and then as a result of him knowing that, it killed it for the rest of our group as well, that was looking at this technology and loved it. And this guy didn't have check writing authority. He'd done all of that stuff, but because he didn't disclose it. So,
Yeah.
share that as your own experience as an investor on how critical that is for entrepreneurs, because now you're also advising and helping entrepreneurs through your cohort on what they have to do, because you're not investing in all of it. They're preparing to go out and invest and get attracted from other companies, and why that's so critical to be really transparent with that.
Yeah, it's critically important. What I will say, I'll say this to investors and to entrepreneurs. I'll say, listen, once an investment is made, the entrepreneur has so many opportunities to abuse the investor. It's not anywhere close to funny. And, because, yeah, sure, I can sue an entrepreneur for something or other, maybe, but proving things, whatever, it's just, it's probably not going to be worth it. So there has to be that level of trust that the investor has, in the entrepreneur. And I'll give you a great example of it's a similar story to what you told. And this is very soon after I had started, getting involved with the Atlanta Technology Angels. And we were in a due diligence meeting. The entrepreneur had been president of a bank, and the bank had gone under in 2008 or 9, during the Great Recession. It might have been 2010 that it went under. But anyway, in this due diligence meeting, the question had come up to this entrepreneur that there had been an FDIC lawsuit against the bank that this entrepreneur had been president of. And his characterization of it was, it was no big deal. I mean, the FDIC sued all the banks that went out of business, and, it was a tough time for all the banks and whatever in that, 2008, 9, 10 timeframe. Well, I was either dumb enough or smart enough to look up the FDIC lawsuit and started reading it. And along about claim 61 or 62 or something, started these claims of how there'd been, I wouldn't exactly say self-dealing, but how there had been assets which were owned by this president of the bank, which the president of the bank had sold back to the bank very shortly before the bank went under. And, yeah, and that the assets, I think, were also had not been secured properly. The president of the bank basically gotten a loan that you and I wouldn't be able to get without having security on the underlying assets, right? If we buy, I won't specify what the asset was, but that makes the story even juicier, but I don't want to give but and had that asset, had we bought that asset with a loan from the bank, the bank would insist on having at least security on that asset. So anyway, he had totally mischaracterized the nature of that suit, and how he had been personally mentioned in that suit and stuff, and for personal assets and whatever. Anyway, it was I didn't return that guy's calls or accept his LinkedIn request or anything like that to connect. I mean, I was done with that, because any hint of dishonesty or lack of transparency, as you mentioned, that is just not good. I mean, that loses immediate faith for me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And it's so, that's one of the things, and I, early on, when in my Compassionate Capitalist coffee breaks, my little video tips that I send out, one of the things I have one that's very specific to transparency because even though public companies will get in trouble and they'll do stuff with their, and we've seen big scandals on that. The whole thing about a public company is that they are public with a lot of this information. They have to be by law. But when it comes to private companies, right, and private investors, there is this trust because there's an expectation that they're going to be transparent, and they have some fraud laws and material concerns and some language that the SEC uses, but it's really up to the entrepreneur to be a full disclosure
Mhm.
and take the hits where they take them, and hope that they're, because they were fully disclosed, their character, or there's a way to box that in or work around that, but at least because they fully disclosed, there's not a violation of trust. There's
Mhm.
another thing, a hurdle you might have to come over, but with the investors, you can't just, every other type of investment has a mandatory type of disclosure. Even like real estate, there is supposed to. Sometimes they don't always tell you that somebody died there, but or whatever. But you know what I mean? It's like in general, there's rules on that, and there technically are rules. But your point about the more time you spend doing due diligence and working through that is a notch in the risk mitigation category for that.
Absolutely. I mean, there was one time when, normally what we'll do is we'll send a questionnaire out to the entrepreneur. They fill out answers, and then we sit down with them and have meetings with them to go over the answers. And I was having a conversation with another ATA member about this other ATA member was suggesting that we could move that process along a little faster of the sitting down with them to go over these questionnaires, because it's it's multiple hours. I mean, typically it would be like maybe 2-3 hour sessions to go through these answers to the questions and ask a lot of questions, additional questions. And they were talking about, maybe we could move that along faster. I'm like, I don't want to move that along faster because, it's like you go on a first date, right? So most people don't ask their date to marry them on the first date, right? Because they kind of want to get to know them a little bit and, understand what kind of person they are and, maybe kiss them or something, who knows? So,
Yeah.
so, with investments, you also want to get to know them. People can be on their best behavior for a date or 2 or 3 or 4, but the more time you spend with them, the more likely you're to see where if they show you some sign that, oh yeah, I lied to this or that person about that to achieve my goal or whatever, it's okay,
Yeah.
that's, you're not going to find out about that on a quote first date with an entrepreneur.
Yeah. Yeah. And perfect segue, since I have a chapter on that in the Inside Secrets to Angel Investing about introduction, first date, courtship, marriage, right? So,
Yep.
yep, it's a very, there are a lot of similarities between in that process, right? So, well, that's about all the time we have, Joe. Thank you so very much. Anything you'd like to close out with that I didn't cover or ask that we want to remind everybody that it is Cranium incubator.com, and go, and even if you're listening to this later, not in the spring of 2021, I'm sure the incubator is still going to be going. There'll still be a cohort coming up. I'm attending your upcoming pitch event for your graduates, and I'm really looking forward to it. And that's the other thing. If you're an investor listening to this, go to the website and look for that event to sign up and look at these companies and see what's going on. So there's something for everybody that's listening today at the Cranium Incubator with Joe Beverly. So
Yeah, there's no cost to attend the pitch event, and we do have a $500 fee for being a part of the incubator, but we have a question on there that lets attendees, we depend on them to be honest, basically to self-select a scholarship level. And so, one of the choices in the drop-down is something like, I can afford the $500. Somebody else is probably better off who needs it more than I do. The next choice is getting a 50% scholarship. In other words, $250 cost would, be really helpful. And then, the third choice is something like getting an 80% scholarship. So in other words, a $100 cost for this would really take a strain off. And you're getting 14 presentation sessions, which are an hour and a half each, plus 14 Q&A sessions, which are an hour and a half each. And then we have the pitch event and a couple other happy hours and stuff that we do to get to know each other. But so it's a lot of content. We really push out a lot of information to people, but we like to think that it's well worthwhile, and we see some evidence that it's helped some folks from the first cohort.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much for taking the time to join with me today and share your insights and experiences, and really excited about what you're doing over there at Cranium. So thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on your show.